Good morning, everyone. Thank you for attending the Place Your Trades Network Spaces. This Spaces is brought to you by TraderVate, which has a custom web app dedicated to trading CME Group's new daily option contracts, including indices, energies, metals, and now Bitcoin. You can also trade these on the DOM on TraderVate's main platform. They're a great way to get exposure to the futures market with limited risk. You can go to placeyourtrades.com to get the TraderVate app for free. I also write a weekly blog and daily pre-market overview on the markets that you can subscribe to at placeyourtrades.com. I will be doing a summary of this episode with my key takeaways that'll be available to download as a PDF. If you're interested in getting this, you can click on the link in my feed or visit placeyourtrades.com/spaces to sign up for it. And the PDF will be available and emailed out to anyone who signs up. I'll also put a link in the nest. And on to our guests. First we have AmirAdnani. Amir is the president, CEO, and founder of Uranium Energy Corp. Under his leadership, the company has become the fastest growing uranium company listed on the NYSE and the largest resource base of fully permitted ISR projects of any US-based producer. Mr. Adnani is also the founder and co-chairman of Gold Mining Inc., a gold resources acquisition and development company that has grown to control a sizable portfolio of gold projects across the Americas, and is the chairman of Uranium Royalty Corp, a uranium royalty company. By background, he is an entrepreneur and earlier started and expanded 2 private companies. Next, we have Marin Katusa. Marin is a Canadian investor, author, hedge fund manager, and founder and chairman of Katusa Research. He is a contrarian and value investor specializing in the resource sector. Starting from scratch, Marin built his large personal fortune all through his ability to find great investments. During his career, he sat on the board of a public company, raised over $1 billion in financing, and written the New York Times best-selling book, The Colder War. Marin's insight has been featured in the Wall Street Journal, New York Times, Bloomberg, and CNBC. He's traveled over 1 million air miles, visiting over 500 resource projects in more than 100 countries. And last but not least, we have Mark Nelson, founder and managing director of Uranium Energy Group. Mark holds a degree in nuclear engineering from Cambridge University and has been a consultant to the clean energy industry and environmental organizations around the world. His analytical work has been covered in the New York Times, Wall Street Journal, and leading European papers. And with that, thank you, gentlemen, for joining us today. I will start with Amir because I know that he has to leave us early. So I wanted to, first let's start kind of on the macro side. Can you talk a little bit about the current macro fundamental environment for uranium and nuclear energy right now? We've had some tough years in the past.
Hey, Tracy, can you hear me okay?
Perfect.
Excellent. Yeah, thanks for having me here. And really the last 11 years we've had in the uranium market and with uranium prices, we've had a total bear market where no one had the incentive to be able to build new mines. And mines, in fact, were cutting back production and there was production curtailment. I would argue, though, that nuclear reactors and nuclear energy globally was still growing during this time. Over 60 new reactors have been connected to the grid since 2013, so over the last decade. And so there was sort of this like quiet, stealth-like growth taking place in nuclear that really kind of hit an inflection point a few years ago when we started to see a convergence of mega trends around decarbonization, around electrification. And then with Russia's invasion of Ukraine, the concerns around energy security, these powerful forces, I think, have created the groundworks for policy that now favors and lands very much at the doorsteps of nuclear power. Policy that basically, again, wants to prioritize and really ask itself, how do we achieve net zero? If you're a government, if you're a corporation that asks a climate scientist to model the way by which you can achieve net zero by any reasonable amount of time, be it 2030, 2040, 2050, you come back to this issue, well, you need nuclear power to achieve that. And you look at again, favorable policy, whether it's in Japan, where, again, the problems really started with the Fukushima disaster in 2011, having seen favorable public opinion support in favor of getting back into nuclear energy as they see rising power costs there, and again, concerns about energy security. We've seen a change in attitude and political support and public support back in favor of nuclear power. We've seen the inclusion of nuclear energy along with natural gas in European taxonomy over the last year. We've seen, again, commitment from governments from the US to Canada to South Korea to Belgium, France, in wanting to see the existing fleet stay financially healthy and strong, but then look for expansion of that. And I think the most exciting segment for me is the potential of small and advanced modular reactors. You look at individuals like Bill Gates, Sam Altman, individuals from Silicon Valley, from the technology industry, coming in and financially backing companies who are looking to build the next generation of more agile, more nimble, smaller units of, again, what are called small and advanced reactors. And small and advanced reactors, the concept's been around for a long time. This is how NASA has conducted space travel and has powered space travel. This is how the nuclear navy and basically submarines and aircraft carriers are powered using these very advanced microreactors. But now you can basically bring that to industrial utilization. Look at Dow Chemical that wants to build a small reactor down in South Texas to provide the energy in a baseload, low carbon manner for their petrochemical operations. Look at Microsoft recently talking about the need for baseload power via SMRs for their data centers. You think about the amount of computing power that is needed to really support and power AI and various, really just, I think, bringing back the arguments for nuclear. So we have a setup today where we're finding incredible support and growth for nuclear power for the various reasons we've talked about, but we've had a decade of underinvestment in uranium and uranium mining and so today we have a structural deficit. There's a over 50 million pound per year deficit compared to 200 million pounds of annual demand. That deficit is also quite concerning because most of the world's uranium is coming out of Kazakhstan and most of the world's enrichment is coming out of Russia. Those two countries collectively combined about 35 to 40% of global uranium and enrichment, respectively. And so when we think about a potentially bifurcated market developing, a Western price for uranium and enrichment, and the fact that, again, we're heavily dependent on Russia still to this day on these issues is quite concerning. So as we speak, we have one of the tightest markets developing in uranium in over a decade. Uranium prices are actually at an 11, 12-year high, and there's just a shortage of uranium. So there's a supply squeeze taking place at a very positive and growth-oriented time for nuclear power.
Thanks. And then let's talk a little about Uranium Energy Corp and some of the current projects that you have going on right now domestically in North America. Yes? Can you hear me? Hello? Can you hear me?
Yep, we hear you.
Hello? Okay. All right, just making sure. Okay, can you hear me, Amir? No? Oh. Hello? Are we glitching? Can you hear me, Amir? Oh, everybody else can. All right. All right, Mark can hear me. Maybe with your speaker off, you can hear me. Amir, I wanted to talk a little bit about Uranium Energy Corp and some of your current projects domestically in North America, both in Canada and the US, and how you've grown this business into one of the preeminent domestic uranium companies. Did he not hear me? You may have to go down and come back up again. I think our space is glitching here. This is not what I wanted. All right, so in the meantime, while we fix the problem with Amir, let's go to Marin. Amir just talked a little bit about the problem with all of the production in Kazakhstan and Russia right now. So, do you foresee a problem? The United States has talked about issuing sanctions on Russia, and so if they do, does the West follow, and what does that mean for uh, for supply?
So let's you could break it down this way, and I wrote about this back in the first book, but Kazatomprom, most of the resources were developed and discovered during the Soviet times, but it was American technology that really unlocked the incredible growth. To put it into perspective, Tracy, if you think about at the turn of the century, so in early 2000, Kazakhs produced less than 1 million pounds, and now they're producing somewhere around 64, 65 million pounds. So the growth of that has made Kazakhs the primary producer in the world, greater than all of OPEC combined. In fact, it'd be OPEC and Russia combined for the impact that the Kazakhs have. So it's about a little over 40% of the global primary production. So yes, they don't use exactly the standards that the rest of the world would do, and they have the benefit of a decreasing tenge currency, but they're having significant issues to increase their production, and they're not hitting their numbers. Now everyone thinks that yes, they can go to 100% penetration, but you need way more sulfuric acid, and that's an issue that we highlighted during COVID, and that's also why they went back to that 10% penetration. With ISR production, it's not like a flick of the switch where you can just produce linearly more. You're going to need way more sulfuric acid per extra pound of depth as you go in. So the costs are going to increase for the Kazakhs. So that's one item also. Now looking globally, when you go to places like Niger, it's quite obvious, and for years, I've stated to be, even though it's an incredible resource, there's a joke in the uranium sector that calls for avoid any investments where there's a French embassy. And the Arlet Basin is one that the French really developed from Ariva, which is now Orano. And that is a move in the rest of Africa where you have lack of infrastructure. Now, the Arlet Basin has the infrastructure, it has great resources, but you have serious issues geopolitically there from a social standpoint. Other places like Namibia in Africa that have great resources, you lack the infrastructure. So you're probably going to need north of $150 a pound to make it truly economic. Hence why these deposits are not new deposits. These deposits have been around for multiple decades of cycles. They were around in the early 80s. They were around in the late 90s, early 2000s, and it's about true cost of production. So that's one aspect. So even if you put in sanctions, the sanctions on the Russians, well, is China going to follow those sanctions? And what China's done is played a double. So they've gone to Madagascar. They've gone to, for example, Husab, which is one of the largest producing mines in the world. That's a Chinese mine. And even though the cost of production is higher than what the current spot price is, it's about long-term security of supply for the nation. And the Chinese will team up with the Russians without a doubt, and they'll ignore the sanctions. It comes down to America still 25% of the global demand. 1 in every 10 homes in America is powered by former Soviet Union material. I know that sounds crazy, but that's where it comes from. And Cameco, which is the largest producer in the West, has the benefit of buying cheap Kazakh pounds, repackaging it as a Canadian pound, and selling it to the U.S. That game's coming to an end. So to me, what I've always stated for over a decade is you want permitted, built production in the U.S. that's unhedged. That's the absolute key, because you don't want hedged production. And so many of these producers, because it was a bear market, Tracy, the bankers would come in, they wanted to reduce their risks. The utilities would give them an offtake. The banker said, you need to take an offtake because we don't really care about your equity price. We just want to guarantee our loans. And they would hedge at 40, $50. That was the stupidest plan you could do. And here we're sitting at a $70 spot market. And what you want exposure to is US production that's built, permitted, and unhedged. And when it comes to the Athabasca, which is the greatest grades in the world, always think CapEx, and that's going to be a big, big issue moving forward. Hopefully that answered your question.
Yes, thank you. And I'm going to actually put that CapEx chart that you had in a report that you did on Twitter, so everybody can see kind of that issue. And then back to Amir. I hope you can hear me now. I hope we fixed the problem.
Yeah, can you hear me?
Perfect. Yes. So I wanted to move on a little bit. You gave us a background on the kind of fundamental macro environment. So I wanted to talk a little bit about your company, Uranium Energy Corp, and kind of some of the projects that you have going on currently in both Canada and the United States, and kind of how you've grown this business into one of the preeminent domestic uranium companies, and how important is it to have domestic supply?
Yeah, Uranium Energy Corp is 18 years in the making, just for context for everyone. And in these 18 years, we've done it all in terms of starting out with a business plan, getting into production in the U.S. After Fukushima, needing to shut the production in, developing projects, making discoveries, permitting projects. Really, the company is very complete in its experience. Having said that, we had a very contrarian approach to growing our business when uranium prices, and again, for everyone's benefit, today the uranium price is $70 a pound. On an inflation-adjusted basis over the last 15, 20 years, it's been as high as $200 per pound. At today's prices, we're significantly higher than where we've been over the last 11 years. The last 11 years, the price has been less than $20 a pound. And for the most part of this period, it was hanging around $20 to $30 a pound. So when uranium prices were in that bottom of the cycle range, in that $20 to $30 range, even as recent, we were the most aggressive company out there in the world making acquisitions of uranium projects and growing our business. We've done, just in the last couple of years, close to $600 million of North American focused acquisitions to grow the company into basically the second largest, after one of the biggest producers out there, Cameco, second largest diversified North American uranium company by resources, by market cap, by licensed capacity to produce uranium in the U.S. And most of our, again, acquisitions were done in a sub $45 uranium price environment, and now uranium's at 70. We think uranium prices are going much higher, both to incentivize production, but also because in today's inflationary world, it's challenging to mine not only uranium, but it's challenging to mine lithium, copper, you name it. These are the issues. So we really benefit, Tracy, from the fact that we have infrastructure. We have above ground 2 of the largest processing plants in the United States that are today licensed, and our licensed capacity in the U.S. is over 8 million pounds a year. U.S. consumes about 50 million pounds a year of uranium. And as Marin mentioned, that's powering 1 in every 5 homes in America. U.S. production is less than 1 million pounds. So you're talking about less than 1 million pounds of domestic production and demand of about 50 million pounds. And that's before you include the U.S. government, which is now also set up a strategic uranium reserve to acquire physical uranium. So the reality is, I think, for my company, we want to make sure that we are the North American supplier that is badly needed in the market today. Again, close to 50% of production comes from Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, and with the recent issues in the country in Niger, which is another just under 10% of global supply. You look around and you just realize that Western suppliers are needed in today's market. We're positioned as the biggest company with respect to North American focused assets to be that reliable supplier. And we think one of the big advantages is really this North American focused in-situ recovery, which is a very low cost, low capital intensity way of getting uranium out of the ground is how the Kazakhs have become the world's #1 producer. The birthplace, the US actually, so it's got tremendous amount of technical history. And
You're cutting out just a little bit. Hello? Can anybody else hear him? Uh-oh. Uh-oh, he dropped again. All right, well, we're getting him back. We'll go to Mark really quick. Let's talk about a little bit of the technicalities here. So a lot of people, particularly in the West, have argued against nuclear because of radioactive waste. Obviously, Chernobyl, Fukushima didn't help those fears. So can you talk a little bit about how nuclear reactors actually worked, how waste is actually stored, and what really happened in these cases and how likely is it to happen again?
Sure. Thanks, Tracy. I think the biggest thing I could say is this. Fear of nuclear energy and nuclear waste is almost exactly fear and anxiety about nuclear bombs and nuclear war. The reason why this is really important is because, as far as I can tell, and I've hunted around the world for the sources of nuclear fear. I've talked to thousands of people at every level of education, status in society, level of leadership, age, you name it, just hunting down what this fear is about. And as far as I can tell, and this is not original, there's a number of other people who now believe the same thing. The dislocating feeling of growing up under increasingly powerful nuclear weapons tests, that was the key thing. So as the generation that grew up under the nightmare of increasingly powerful, novel nuclear weapons, saber rattling and development and bomb creating and missile launching, as that generation fades out of power and younger decision makers who grew up in a world that was already, shall we say, fully nuclear weaponized, the levels of fear driving anxiety about nuclear energy is just dropping off a cliff. So it's not unusual for me to meet, say, really intense left-wing activist students who are against nuclear energy and they don't fear it one bit. Meaning if their politics changes tomorrow, or if they're told that actually we on the left are for nuclear because our union says that we're for nuclear now, they'll switch on a dime because it's just an aesthetic thing. It's not fear based. So what we're seeing broadly is that young people are born into a world not knowing about nuclear, but also not being afraid of it. And the second they come into contact with nuclear energy, typically on the internet, typically with some of the advanced reactor concepts that Amir described, they become radically pro-nuclear all at once, regardless of pre-existing political commitments. Whereas we're seeing old people have deathbed conversions where they say, well, I guess I was wrong about nuclear energy. I was just really scared. And we're seeing that all the time. Like a lot of the Hollywood A-listers that helped usher in the 70s, the anti-nuclear world, sort of coming from the student protests of '68 and the general rebellion against the man, which was considered a way to rebel against, say, militarism and colonization and Vietnam. You could rebel against all of that by protesting your local nuclear plant in California as a Hollywood actor. All of that is coming to its sort of, shall we say, natural conclusion. And people are finding their way to nuclear energy sort of from all directions. So that's what we're seeing now. I'll pause there for a second. Tracy, you sort of asked a bunch of things all at once. I can give the very basics of what's so special about nuclear energy from the perspective of nuclear power, but I just wanted to pause for a moment.
Yeah, absolutely. If you could just go kind of, again, explain a little bit how nuclear waste is stored so it's not, you know, this big fear-based situation, and kind of maybe in broad strokes, how a nuclear reactor actually even works.
Sure. So some atoms in the universe are super chubby. They have a lot of particles in their nucleus, and this makes them able to be split And it so happens that this gives off energy. Fusion is the opposite, by the way. Fission is the splitting of atoms to get energy. Fusion is the combining of atoms to get energy. So why does this work? Well, go ask your friendly, particle physics and quantum physics professors if you want the details. Just accept that it happens. If you take a chunky atom and crack it open, it gives you energy. If you take tiny atoms and combine them, it gives you energy. So where do these fat atoms come from? They come from star collisions and from neutron stars that run into each other and slam together at super high energy, and that energy is absorbed in making these chubby atoms. Then those atoms spew out into the universe, also happens from supernovas, and they end up in gas clouds that can turn into, say, galaxies and then to solar systems like ours. So Earth has a complement of uranium, which is the heaviest, chubby, naturally occurring, long-lived atom. That's why uranium is so special, and you hear about it a lot, because it's as big as atoms get while still lasting long enough in the history of our solar system for us to grow up, get big brains, and then dig it up from the ground with Amir's company. So where does that leave us? We've got this chunky uranium, and it turns out it gives us energy when you split it apart. In fact, in the past, billion years ago, there was a patch of uranium so rich in the soils of what is now Africa, in Gabon, West Africa, that groundwater trickling through was able to trigger a nuclear reaction that started making heat, boiled off the water, which shut off the natural reactor, and so on for tens of millions of years. And this was actually theorized and then discovered in the ground by the French digging in Gabon. So how does a nuclear reactor work? You get enough uranium together, as depicted in the recent Oppenheimer film, and it starts to get spicy. A nuclear reactor is designed to work where you bring in just enough uranium, just close enough together, that the addition of a few tricks to get it to react is enough to get it moving, but not to go crazy. In a nuclear bomb, it's the opposite. You slam together an immense amount of uranium of high enough a sufficient amount of uranium at high enough purity that it goes bang all at once. These are very, very different ways of making chain reactions. One can't do the other. So in nuclear energy, what you do is you get uranium-238 with a little bit of uranium-235. It's naturally occurring, but as Amir talked about the issues in enrichment, you need to add more U-235 atoms for most of today's reactor designs to get them to work. You put them together, and most of today's designs work by putting water, H2O, plain old water, in between the uranium chunks. And what that does is it slows down a few neutrons because they slam into the water and get slow. That allows uranium to absorb the neutron easier, and that makes the uranium unstable, and it cracks apart in another chain. And what makes it a chain reaction is when uranium cracks apart, it releases particles, including neutrons. Those can start another uranium atom or two splitting. So there's the chain reaction. What a nuclear reactor is a big kettle for letting this happen at a controlled rate according to our desires. And what nuclear fuel is a very hard, dense lump of uranium in bits surrounded, and this is a typical way that fuel is made in today's reactors. This uranium is surrounded by metal rods. The metal rods are joined together to make fuel assemblies. The fuel assemblies are joined together with other fuel assemblies in a core, and the core has water passing through it to help start the reaction. The reaction makes heat. The water passing through takes the heat away. You make hot water that way. Hot water makes steam. Steam turns a turbine. Turbine makes us electricity. When you run out of energy that you can get from your fuel assembly in the reactor as you've designed it, you open up the reactor, take out the fuel assembly, and you let it sit, slowly giving off its heat in water until it's cool enough to put into a container. That container sits in a building or on a concrete pad outside the nuclear plant, and people wage big legal wars over it, but it doesn't really do anything and has a perfect safety record of not hurting anybody that we could expect to continue for, just to be safe, a few more centuries until we can figure out if we want to put it in a hole in the ground or reprocess it put it back into reactors, let it just sit there. The stakes are almost zero in terms of safety, which means that it becomes a huge flashpoint for, I don't know, spiritual and legal reasons. There's no need to make a facility like Yucca Mountain to put the waste in. Yucca Mountain has been a catastrophe for the nuclear industry because it gave an enormous amount of leverage in Washington to anti-nuclear campaigners who told Nevada politicians that they would stop Yucca Mountain. But the reason they were wanting to do this was to destroy nuclear energy, not to just stop Yucca Mountain. So I'm a part of the growing number of voices that believes that nuclear waste has always been a fake problem used as leverage by anti-nuclear activists to destroy nuclear energy. Germany, I'll end with an anecdote from Germany. In Germany, the nuclear waste agency was turned over to Green Party activists, and they spent millions of euros and decades going around the country scaring Germans about the dangers of nuclear energy and nuclear waste. Although their mission was supposed to find a place to put the nuclear waste, instead they made it to where it's almost impossible to consider the German people ever allowing a nuclear waste facility because the money was expropriated and misused to scare people about nuclear waste rather than to reassure them or to locate a storage depot location. So that's the story with nuclear waste. As people are losing their fear of nuclear energy, the nuclear waste issue is being revealed as essentially a fraud. Nuclear waste is tiny. There's almost none of it, self-contained, and it just sits there.
Excellent. Thank you. And Amir, we have you back again.
I have no idea what the issue is here, but yeah, where did you lose me? I'm more great content there by Mark and Marin, so I could hear them, but you keep losing me when I come to speak.
I know we have a glitch. We kind of left off where you were talking about in-situ recovery, ISR. So I kind of wanted to dig in the weeds a little bit about that technology and how this differs from other recovery mechanisms, and what does this mean for capital intensity and environmental impacts?
Basically, the in-situ recovery method was in many ways developed by the oil and gas industry in the US going back 35, 40 years ago, because the oil and gas industry was in fact very much involved with uranium mining. No surprise, uranium is an energy commodity. And in the US in particular, you would typically find uranium deposits in some kind of geophysical relationship to hydrocarbon deposits. Typically where you have a deep-seated oil and gas deposit or a reservoir, you would typically see uranium form over geologic time near surface. So companies like Exxon, Chevron, ConocoPhillips were all involved in uranium mining in the 70s, 80s, and this is how the industry was developed in the US. And these companies really looked at the fact that certain uranium deposits are in permeable sandstone settings where you can dissolve the uranium in solution as opposed to digging and excavating, basically conventional mining techniques where you're removing basically or doing strip mining. You didn't need to do that with these sandstone hosted uranium deposits. And it's interesting today to look back at this history, because today you can very much see a trend that uranium very much still belongs in the energy complex. And there definitely could be a trend of seeing major oil and gas companies who obviously today more than ever are trying to be green and want to look at ways of growing their businesses with emission-free type of fuels coming back into uranium. And then, of course, after the end of the Cold War, we saw this incredible growth in the country of Kazakhstan. Kazakhstan went from being less than 5% of global supply to over 35% of global supply in a span of 15 to 20 years. And it was all utilizing the in-situ recovery method that we're talking about with their low-grade deposits. And that country, they use sulfuric acid for their basically leaching agents. In the US, we use an alkaline type of reagent. So basically, we use a higher pH, whereas the Kazakhs use a lower pH. But in principle, the two methods are the exact same. So I think this is really telling about two things. It's telling about the fact that moving forward, again, there could be a big move into the uranium industry and even nuclear industry by diversified energy companies. But also at the same time, the fact that the US does have the wherewithal, does have the geologic formations and deposits that could very well be at the same scale and potential of what the Kazakhs have accomplished over the last 20 years. The potential for ISR is massive. It's a game changer technology for recovering uranium, and certainly has huge cost advantages over conventional mining. And look, this is what we're focused on with my company, with Uranium Energy in Wyoming and Texas. And this is one of the reasons 2 years ago we stepped up and acquired a business called Uranium One Americas. Uranium One was a wholly owned subsidiary of Rosatom, that's Russia's nuclear energy company. Some of your listeners or yourself, Tracy, you probably remember that for years, people talked about why is the Russian government able to own these U.S. assets on U.S. soil. For 12 years, they did that. And we were able to finally acquire these assets from them. And this deal closed around 60 days before the invasion of Ukraine. Of course, no one had any idea this is what they were planning. But I guess in hindsight, we realized why, in fact, they were finally willing to sell after a decade of accumulating these assets and investing over $1 billion into their initiatives in the U.S. So, look, there's a reason the Russians wanted to own ISR projects in Wyoming, right? They saw the potential. They saw these could be big projects. And ultimately, I'm really pleased that we were able to acquire them. It positions us very well. But also, I think there's a very promising future for in-situ recovery production in the U.S.
And thanks. And another question. So now that we have current spot prices are just over $66 right now, which is huge. It's looking like particularly your projects in Texas and Wyoming are, economically viable. So what can investors kind of look forward to from UEC going into 2024?
This is probably the most exciting time for our company and for our shareholders, because we've been extremely disciplined in saying we're not going to restart production and sell uranium until the uranium price has really stabilized above $60 a pound. Want to see it stabilized there for a quarter. So you're right, that takes you to the end of this year. But starting calendar year 2024, and if prices remain above 60, which I'm confident they will, we will be able to announce restart of our production. And that could take us about 6 to 7 months to achieve. So by middle of 2024, we could be in a very exciting position of producing uranium, starting initially at our Wyoming operations. And then from there, we would look to develop and restart our Texas projects as well. But this is certainly a very exciting time to be in that position. We want to see this uranium price that, just to put it in perspective, the price was at $50 for most of this year, right? And over the last 30 days, we've seen an inflection point, and we've seen the price pop over 60, get to 70. It's consolidating around 69 right now. And again, look, obviously, as an unhedged company, we want to see a bit of price stabilization before we jump in. But this is exciting. Most companies or producers that signed long-term contracts last year were signing long-term contracts with $70 ceilings or fixed pricing. Well, in an environment where we're already at 70, and potentially with the supply squeeze that we have, could be on our way to $100 a pound. We could be there easily within the next 12 months, potentially here. This is the kind of position you want to have, where you've got no ceilings, you've got that ability to restart production on your own terms. You don't have any debt. We're a debt-free company. So here the situation is that you have a 100% unhedged, 100% unlevered, fully focused on North America company that did what you would expect mining companies to do: grow at the bottom of the cycle. Typically, the majors do the opposite, right? And that's kind of tongue-in-cheek, where they make big acquisitions at the top of the commodity cycle. But then you see a situation here where we've been disciplined to make acquisitions at the bottom of the cycle. We've acquired some very strategic production-ready assets in the U.S., like our Uranium One portfolio. After we see this price stabilization period for the next quarter, 2024 could be just a very exciting year for us. And Tracy, not too many companies can say that, right? Because most uranium projects today in North America are not even permitted for construction, yet alone production restart. And so permitting is a real bottleneck when it comes to mine development, because North America, doesn't matter how badly we need uranium, it takes 5 to 10 years, and these days more like 10 years, to permit new uranium projects. And again, one of the issues is you could have a $200 uranium price. If your project's not permitted, you can't construct. It doesn't matter. We have 7 fully permitted projects in Texas and Wyoming, and 2 fully permitted and operational processing plants. So the reality is, we can talk about supply demand all day long, but when you ask yourself granular questions like, who can actually build a mine? Is the mine actually permitted for construction? You realize why the supply side is so challenged today, and it will take longer to really develop and come online. So as the Fed says, maybe rates are going to be higher for longer. I think we're going to have a period of uranium prices higher for longer.
And with that, our higher rates are obviously affecting new projects as well, right? It takes a lot of funding to get capital to make these projects. So higher for longer is, I think, in my opinion, and maybe you can tell me if you agree or disagree, that this is making some sort of energy scarcity as well, or commodity scarcity.
Well, at the end of the day, this is about a commodity that has huge scarcity around it. Uranium is a depleting commodity, unlike, let's say, I don't know, let's just take gold, for example, where it's got some jewelry applications and currency applications. Uranium is just used for one thing: it's to generate energy, and a reactor needs to basically burn up uranium or nuclear fuel to generate power, and then reload again. And I'm sure Mark can speak to this as well. But look, the reality is that price inelasticity is a beautiful thing. And in uranium and nuclear power, nuclear reactors are not as price sensitive to the input cost of uranium as, let's say, a natural gas-fired plant would be. In a gas-fired power plant, almost 70% of operating cost is the fuel costs. In a nuclear reactor, especially one that's built already and is getting a 20-year license extension, and through the IRA received billions of dollars of tax credits, fuel cost is less than 5% of your operating costs. The reality is uranium prices can go much higher and stay much longer, and the end user, the reactors, and the end user being the electricity end user, is not going to be significantly impacted the same way it would be if it was a hydrocarbon-based power plant. So that's the good news in all of this. And the other part of this is, we have to remember that nuclear utility companies are in their best financial shape and health today that they've ever been in. And because, again, programs like the IRA, other initiatives by governments that's not giving these utilities credit for their emission-free power generation capacity that nuclear has, is making them much stronger financial end users of the uranium than any time in the last 20 years that I've been in this industry. So these are kind of the key takeaways, that we don't want to sound greedy about the fact that we think uranium prices are higher, going higher. They have to go higher because it's a depleting commodity. There's a structural deficit. But at the end of the day, uranium is a very small percentage of overall cost to run a nuclear reactor. Excellent.
Thank you very much. I really appreciate your time today. I know that you're on a time crunch. So I will go to Marin. Back to Marin. So we talked a little bit about the supply demand issue. I put your CapEx chart up in the nest as well. So given that, so where are the biggest expansion markets right now for nuclear energy in terms of mining and or projects? And what's the most exciting thing going on in this industry, do you find right now?
So I think you have to break it up into the East versus the West. Like I talked about in my book, The Colder War. You got the old world, the Soviet influenced world, as they say, all roads lead back to Moscow. So the Kazakhs, the Uzbeks, people forget about Uzbekistan, also a big producer. So that's going with, let's call, the China side of things. Then you've got the West, Canada. You look at some of the great big mines, Cigar Lake, MacArthur River, McLean Lake. Those are the biggies on the east side of the Athabasca Basin in Saskatchewan, a province in Canada. But unfortunately, it's north of Santa Claus, meaning it -30 in the winter and +40 in the summer. And to build a mine there, you have to house people, and especially the refineries, the mills. So, like for example, McLean Lake is the equivalent of a 2 billion barrel a year refinery. That's world class. That's huge. It costs billions and billions of dollars to build that in today's dollars, because you have to house hundreds of people 24/7. And it's not just the typical exploration camp. You got to feed them. And when in 2017, I was the first person allowed to get exclusive video footage for my subscribers, never allowed before at McLean Lake, where, first of all, it's a radioactive facility, but you got 230 rooms, and think of it as a really nice university dormitory, but they have a band room, theater room, exercise room, because these people are 12 hours on, 12 hours off for 14 days straight, and then a new shift fly-in. These are fly-in areas. So after I was digging around, and if you look at that chart that you just posted about the global uranium exploration budget, to me, it was so simple. Why do I want to go to places with such risk, specifically negative swap line nations, or also AK-47 nations, to develop new mines when you could go to areas and pick up, for example, what Amir did with UEC was brilliant, permitted, built. He bought off the Russians for basically 15 cents on the dollar, and that was all permitted and built. That was brilliant. Everybody talks about the Hillary Clinton uranium scandal. That was the assets that was sold to the Russians for billions of dollars, and then UEC bought it just before the invasion in February of 2022. That's brilliant. Stay unhedged. Another brilliant strategy is to royalties. People don't realize that royalties are the absolute, like the biggest gold mining company is not the actual miners. It's Franco-Nevada, the royalty company. So Uranium Royalty Corp, which, open disclosure, I'm a big shareholder of, and I'm a very big believer, picked up royalties on the biggest producing mines in the West, like Cigar Lake, MacArthur River. You look at what they've done with the big Langer Heinrich. You look at other aspects. So when a company, now that exploration budget starts increasing, the royalty companies get exposure to all of that exploration and development for free. They don't take any of the mining risk. They don't take any of the exploration risk, and they get the royalty up front. So that's the absolute key to all of this. So I like to de-risk my investment, and I don't like taking development risk, permitting risk, exploration risk. Mining is a crappy business. Everything that can go wrong and more will. And I love royalties. I like to get paid first. And that's a company that's listed on the NASDAQ, and its ticker symbol is UROY. I think that that's the way I want exposure with. And this company was created when uranium was trading less than $25 a pound. They cut a deal, a very strategic deal, with the Kazakhs. So that's what I want to do, is be positioned in companies that were there when uranium wasn't popular, not when it was cool. You always want to buy when it's, a contrarian bet or hated. Uranium's now cool. You got Silicon Valley all over uranium with the SMRs. So yes, I would avoid the management teams who used to be copper or lithium or crypto, and now they're uranium, and they can kind of spell uranium. But I would stick to the guys like Amir, who have spent 18 years, the ups and downs, put their marriages on the line multiple times to keep their companies alive. Those are the guys that you make fortunes with.
Excellent. Thank you. And we'll go back to Mark. Mark, you once I think famously said, nuclear is an expensive way to produce cheap electricity, while wind and solar are cheap ways to produce expensive electricity. Can you elaborate a bit on that?
Sure. So the point of this apparent paradox is that the price for putting in part of the electricity system, the generation, is not the price that people can pay over a long term in order to access electricity. I think that a lot of what people are misunderstanding with Germany is that their nuclear plants were underpinning cheap industrial electricity, because the nuclear plants were only costing about 20 euros a megawatt hour to produce electricity over decades of time after being paid off. And without that cheap power to mix into long-term contracts for heavy energy users in industry, then you can't actually take cheap wind turbines and cheap solar panels, put them on the grid, and deliver cheap energy to factories. First of all, the wind and solar is actually quite a lot more expensive in countries like Germany that don't have much sun or wind. So that's another thing. When people are citing cheapest energy ever, they're typically talking about wind and solar projects with essentially free financing, almost no risk built in countries where show projects are used to make extreme low price points for basically it's a pissing contest, if I can be a little vulgar. And that does not represent the cost that a company that wants electricity can pay to get contracted electricity from wind and solar power plants. It always has to be blended into the rest of the electricity. And when you do that, you end up with very high prices that are not industrially competitive. So nuclear, being a very steady producer, especially in reliable plants like the Germans had, you know which few weeks a year the plant isn't in production. You know that long in advance. You almost never have accidental stops. And you know year after year that despite uranium prices going up and down, fuel prices are going to remain a small percentage and a stable percentage of your cost of production. All of this means that we are now getting to the first era where wind and solar has been in place long enough for people to need to start replacing the wind and solar without cheap electricity coming out of it that can be contracted to companies. What do I mean by that? Well, I'm comparing to the nuclear plants that operate generation after generation. Eventually, they're just cash generating machines. I'm going to end this with a little anecdote from a former TVA official I talked to, who said that after years of attempting to get one of their nuclear plants, Browns Ferry, up and running, they now have, and it produces power at $15 a megawatt hour. Now, that it might be 16 or 17 with a bit of inflation over the last few years, but that's still a price that's simply extreme and unmatchable, not even just for other clean electricity supplies, not even for just other steady electricity supplies, but for pretty much anything. In fact, I can't help laugh at the irony that the only electricity supplies that I've heard of that compare to that isn't even hydro. Hydro typically costs more to maintain the reservoir than that does. But it's actually lignite coal coming out of big open pit mines with trains running directly to coal burning plants in Germany and Eastern Europe. Those are typically the only facilities that are competitive. But Europe, as led by Germany, has passed special carbon taxes that push the price of that power to 3 to 5 times the cost of production, meaning it is no longer competitive as an industrial electricity source. So people ask, well, what is it that actually makes the wind and solar expensive if it isn't necessarily the capital cost? Well, many of you would be able to fill in the blanks yourself, I'm sure. It's the lines and wires. It's the hedging. It's the weather risk. It's the middlemen who have to take on huge amounts of risk by taking on, buying power from inconsistent sources and having to blend it together with other sources, including volatilely priced natural gas, in order to offer the steady service that companies that need constant power have to buy.
Well, thank you for that succinct answer. Back to Marin. You wrote a piece on the echo market cycle. Can you kind of talk a little bit about that, and where is uranium in this cycle?
Sure. So the simple strategy was, after doing this for 20 years, there's the boom, then there's the bust, and then there's the echo. right? The echo is when things go sideways. So I think we're in the tail end, just exiting the echo in uranium this year. So, for example, there was no doubt that you had the big boom from 2004, 2003, when we started financing these projects, to about 2007. Uranium did peak out before the global financial crisis hit. That was an interesting item. It basically peaked out in May of 2007. And then it kind of corrected after the global financial crisis. It continued the boom, and then Fukushima shook it up, and that was February of 2011. So that was a big reality check, and then you had the big bust, and the bust took a couple of years. And during that time, Tracy, what is interesting is so many producers were signing long-term agreements with the utilities and bankers who required that for their debt facilities, which basically just depleted their reserves. And I've been fortunate enough to visit every operating mine in the US, and I just sit with all these CEOs and say, what are you doing? This makes no sense, specifically on ISR. And that's when I came up with the strategy in 2000 in January of 2013, when I published, you got to be careful about depleting your reserves at $40. And I said it made no sense. And then in 2015, the World Nuclear Fuels Market, that's where the big conference once a year where all the producers get together with the buyers, the utilities. The board of WFMN asked me to give the keynote in Paris in 2015 on uranium. And I said, look, it's going to go lower because of the currency, and it's all about the Kazakh production. And the Americans are hedged. So you have to look at that. Now, fast forward almost a decade, those hedges are unwound. Now you're looking at the Kazakhs who are saying they have to go to 100% penetration. You're looking at the issues, the security supply issues. It took over a year for the Kazakhs to ship uranium. For example, Tracy, in the spot market, historically, as you'll know in most commodities, it's 30-day pay, 30-day settlement, right? Well, the last big shipment in the spot market took 8 months. It was a 30-day contract to deliver, but it took 8 months to deliver. And this is something that the spot market hasn't yet awoken to. You have RFPs from the Koreans and Japanese coming out for millions and millions of barrels. And where's that going to come? Well, this time, I believe the US producers have learned that they're not going to hedge at low prices. Will they hedge at 80, 85, 90? Perhaps. Will the Kazakhs? Well, the Kazakhs have just created their own version of the Sprott Uranium Fund, or SPUT, because they've realized that Cameco has been taking advantage of this. So the game has really changed. I think we're out of the echo now. I think the cheap deals, picking up assets like UEC did, or these royalties on producing mines, just like Franco-Nevada did that in the early days of the gold boom in Nevada. I think that day is done. Now you want to be positioned with the companies that have maximum exposure with the minimum risk. Is MarinKatusa going to Africa to look for exploration stories with a geologist with a box of crayons and a drill rig dream? Not my game. Been there, done it, and very rarely does it work. The cost of capital in today's world is too high, and that's something else that people haven't realized. This is the first boom cycle for uranium where now we're not in a cutting interest rate environment. We're in a actual increasing cost of capital environment. More importantly, if you look at the exploration world of funds, you've never seen a bigger withdrawal of the ETFs that fund the exploration and development of resources than you've seen in the last 2-3 years. So as you've seen an incredible increase of capital inflows in ETFs like TLT, you've seen the opposite in the resource ETFs. And for me, why would you take incredible exploration, political, and development risk where you have no infrastructure when you can just go to the US? And people forget that just 30 years ago, the US was the world's largest producer of uranium. Now, in the early 80s, it produced over 35 million pounds of uranium. So now it produces less than 1 million. In the right environment, The deposits have not been depleted. There's great places in Texas and Wyoming, which is kind of the key areas for production. Would I go conventional in the US? No. I think the costs are going to be too high. You're going to need north of $80 a pound. And would I build a new mill in Athabasca? I think the capex is going to be too high, so I wouldn't take that risk either. So I like the royalty way and permitted built unhedged production in the US. That's where I think the best upside for this next leg of the uranium cycle is.
Excellent, thank you. And then one more question for Mark, and then we'll do the final round. We've talked, well, both Marin and Amir have mentioned SMRs, but some people might not really be familiar how this is different from, say, a traditional reactor. So can you just kind of explain, what this technology looks like, and where is it, how is it more beneficial as far as maybe lead times and things of that nature to get up and running?
Sorry, was that to me or to Marin?
That was to Mark.
Okay, great. Yeah, so he's not here anymore, and I hope he doesn't mind me saying this, but my optimism in nuclear is completely independent of words like advanced or SMR. Do I think that there are going to be new reactors of new designs? Yes. Do I think that some of them are going to be small? Yes. Is the radical majority of things called an SMR or advanced almost complete bullshit? Yep, that's the case too. In fact, one of the things I'm bracing myself for is with this bloom in SMR companies, we're going to have waves of SMR company failures. Not all SMRs, small modular reactors, are either small or modular, and some are barely reactors. It's just a marketing term for when nuclear wasn't popular, and the safe way to get talking about nuclear was to say, no, wait, existing nuclear is horrible, but if we change the design, it's totally different. A lot of so-called advanced designs are just reheated, underdeveloped, bad ideas that were discarded in the past. Some of them are going to be working. Some of them are going to work really well. There's a bunch of companies working on a design of reactor that the US had a development program in, but dropped it off. The French had a program. The Brits had a program. For various reasons, they didn't get up and running. The Russians got them to work right, and they don't sell any of them because they cost 20% more to run than their traditional reactor. Is that advanced? Well, I guess if being 20% more expensive is advanced, there's a lot of rhetoric that is just nonsense, where in fact, I think that the reason why SMRs have taken off in conversation in the West is because of our incompetence so far at building large reactors. As we work our problems out, as we work out how to hire and manage engineering contracting companies, as we work out which designs to build and not to change, as we work out training new batches of regulators and new batches of engineers, as we work all that out, I anticipate a bunch of projects quietly just accepting that they're going to build either large reactors or they're going to wait a while. Now, does that mean nobody's going to build smaller reactors? No. I mean, look, there's a bunch of smaller reactors that have already been built and put into operation around the world. No one calls them advanced or SMRs because, again, this is mostly marketing bullshit, right? So, for example, I visited reactors of exactly the same power output and very similar design in in Slovakia this year as what Rolls-Royce is proposing to build in England. Doesn't mean that Rolls-Royce reactors won't work. They may be just fine. It's just that nobody else besides me calls the Slovakian reactors SMRs. Yet, if they were just built today, they would be called SMRs. See my point? So, typically, what are the variations? A difference in size of output. No, this doesn't mean necessarily different size. The NuScale reactor vessels, the part that contains the fuel and has the coolant like water going through it, are actually larger than the reactor vessels of the EPR, one of the largest reactors in the world built today. EPR reactors are 1,700 megawatts. NuScale reactors are 77 megawatts. Yet the NuScale is actually a larger reactor. That's why I don't even like the size thing, because that gets mixed up too. So size is one thing. which coolant used, either water or liquid sodium metal or molten salt. Those are some of the coolants being proposed, or even hot gases. But of course, almost all of these reactors have predecessor devices that were used or are used today around the world. So the novelty is as much excitement about nuclear energy and optimism for the future of nuclear energy as it is any compelling arguments about different design features. Again, it sounds like I'm raining on everyone's parade. No, I have a number of technologies that I like as a nuclear nerd, as a nuclear engineer. I'm following a number of companies. I think that small reactors where people are willing to pay premium prices to displace diesel generators, I think that's going to be an extremely fascinating area to watch. I want to repeat something Amir said, and that a company like Microsoft, whose growth is constrained almost purely by access to even medium-priced, steady electricity, they will push forward and work with any company willing to say that they can get a nuclear reactor of quality design built rapidly, and they're going to find an audience with Microsoft, and Microsoft, I anticipate, will place big fat orders for reactors of smaller sizes just in order to ensure they have absolute stability of power supply and can replace expensive diesel generators without waiting on the really long lead time with our electricity grids to get proper large power plants up and running. Not proper nuclear of any type, I mean. It's hard to build almost anything on the grid now. And I think that what will win over the next decade will be large nuclear power plants of traditional stable design, even as brilliant young talent, engineers, capital storm in to try to fill in the niches with advanced reactors.
Excellent, thank you. And for the final round, we've kind of gone over the hour here a little bit, but Marin, we'll start with you. The question is the same for both of you. It's basically you talk about something that you wanted to talk about that we haven't been able to discuss, and or what should we as investors in this sector be looking at over, the next, 24, 36 months?
I think Mark brought up an interesting point. One thing I find interesting is the World Nuclear Association doesn't include any of the future growth of what is called SMRs that the Silicon Valley, like Sam Altman or Peter Thiel or Bill Gates are pushing. So that's one thing. But when I spoke to the guys I know who are on the boards, the reason is because they're not paying members. So be careful with your future supply numbers, because there's always a reason why things are included or not included. And I just think, again, Tracy, keep things simple. I would if you wouldn't take your family on a vacation to the region, you probably want to avoid thinking about investing in a company. Yes, Niger has great deposits. So does Namibia. But no one's been able to make it fly, including France, which supported Areva, which is now Orano. They've got their tail between their legs exiting there. So be careful of going to jurisdictions and also areas that don't have the proper rule of law for mining. I like to keep it simple and it's just, my numbers are super simple. Just based off of current operating demand, where is the uranium going to be coming from? And remember what the Russians and Kazakhs and Uzbeks, they're going to stay together because of the refinement. Remember, you may produce the yellow cake, but what happens to that after the processing? And that's where the Russians have a strong grip of 48% of the refinement capacity. So I would keep it very simple, and I'm more focused on North American de-risked assets, and that's what I would remind investors to look at.
Excellent, thank you. And Mark, the same question. We can talk about something that we haven't been able to discuss that you wanted to discuss, and or, what should we be looking at in this industry over the next, 24 or 36 months?
Well, in trying to find a large reactor type for the West to build that I like, it's been kind of interesting because, look, when countries rock up to Moscow and want a giant nuclear plant, Russians can build almost every type of nuclear plant. They have advanced reactors, they have little reactors, they have floating reactors. What do countries like Turkey and Egypt buy? The same damn thing every time. A pack of 4 standard 1 gigawatt size nuclear reactors of traditional design. That's what they buy. That's what Russia is building in China, in India, in Egypt, in Turkey. It's the standard thing. They build it well. They work extremely well. And here's another thing that people are not, I think, taking seriously enough. The type of reactor that the world is moving towards, most of the reactors in the world today are already this design, are functionally immortal. It's not clear how many more decades or even centuries these things are going to last. They are permanent. We do not know that for certain over the same time horizons with a lot of the novel designs. They might, but they might not be. Anything like a nuclear plant lasting for multiple generations breaks our traditional tools of finance and accounting. We do not have a way to understand or talk about a nuclear plant that is $70 or $80 a megawatt hour to all-in costs for the construction period in first 25 years, followed by 100 years of $20 a megawatt hour. It's almost impossible to think about such a thing, right? So I look in the West and I say, what's going to compete against the Russian mega plants? What's going to compete against the Chinese mega plants? And I keep coming back to the Westinghouse AP1000. It might have been a General Electric design called the ABWR, but they've stopped building that. They maintain the license for it. They can build it in the US, but without anyone asking for it, it's sort of fallen by the wayside. So I think that the bulk of nuclear electricity over the coming century is still going to come, and therefore, of course, the bulk of the uranium demands is going to come from large traditional reactors that work well from the day they're turned on until decade after decade after decade after decade after decade. We don't even know how long they're going to last. And I think that Westinghouse AP1000 is likely to be the one that comes in there. It doesn't mean that Westinghouse has a great record of making money on these things. It doesn't mean that utilities in the US are yet lining up to build it. Most utilities in the US are looking at smaller reactors, but I think it's just a way to not scare their boards and get fired. I think that some smaller reactors are going to be pursued, but it really is going to be a century of consolidation, in my opinion, around large light water reactors for electricity production. Having said that, I think that high temperature reactors, meaning that the hot gases coming out of them are able to do work in either making electricity or making heat for industrial processes at much higher temperatures than today's reactors. I think this is going to happen. And I think that the oil and gas producing companies and countries are going to take an extremely keen interest in nuclear. I mean, many of them already have. Saudi Arabia is pursuing its diplomacy in the Middle East on the basis of wanting a nuclear reactor program now and wanting the US to at least be able to bid, or US-based technologies to be a part of it. They'll move forward no matter what, in my opinion, but they really, really want all the offers on the table, East and West, to choose from for their program. And that's driving a lot of the bumpy events that we're seeing, as far as I can tell. Oil and gas countries that have nuclear energy and hydrocarbons will be in the driver's seat in the energy world.
Excellent. Thank you. Gentlemen, thank you. Everybody, thank you for attending today. Sorry about the glitches earlier, but I appreciate you sticking with us. Follow everybody that was on the panel today. They all post really good information. Of course, follow Place Your Trades to see what else they have going on over there. And with that, again, thank you, gentlemen, for your time today. I really, really appreciate it. And we'll see you next Wednesday.